The gate guard's spear came down hard, striking the stone an inch from Wren Ashby's foot, and still she did not move back. Rain hammered the walls of the northern stronghold, turning the courtyard into a sheet of black water. Wren had walked for 3 days without rest, and her boots had long since given up keeping the cold out. She looked up at the guard, at the water running down his helmet and into his eyes, and she did not blink. "I need to see the king," she said again. "Tonight, not tomorrow." "The king sees no one without an appointment," the guard said. "Least of all some border girl who smells like a barn." Behind her, thunder rolled across the mountains, and Wren felt the ache in her legs turn to fire. She had left her village 4 days ago, when the first child had stopped waking in the mornings, when the well water had begun to smell of rot, when the elders had run out of names for what was killing them one by one. She had not walked through storms and wolf country, and 3 checkpoints of increasingly hostile guards, to be turned away by a man holding a spear. "Then let me wait," she said, "here, until he does." The guard laughed, short and without humor, and turned his back on her, as if that settled the matter. Wren did not move. She pulled her soaked cloak tighter around her shoulders, and sank down against the stone wall beside the gate, drawing her knees to her chest, and she waited. An hour passed, then 2. The other guards changed shifts and looked at her with the mild curiosity people reserve for stray animals, wondering how long she would last before the cold drove her off. Wren watched the torches gutter and relight in the wind, and thought of Petra, 12 years old, lying in her mother's arms, with lips gone the color of ash. She thought of old Hollis, who had built half the houses in the village with his own hands, now too weak to lift a spoon. She thought of the promise she had made before she left, that she would not come back without help, and the thought kept her spine straight, even as her body began to shake from the cold. By the 3rd hour, one of the younger guards, a boy who could not have been older than 17, crouched near her and offered a corner of his own cloak. "You'll die out here," he said quietly. "The king hasn't granted an audience to an outsider in years, not since." He stopped himself, glancing toward the keep's highest tower, where a single window burned with lamplight long after every other window had gone dark. "Since what?" Wren asked. The boy shook his head and would not answer, but his eyes flicked again to that tower, and Wren filed the gesture away, the way she filed away every small clue when she was diagnosing a patient whose symptoms did not add up. It was near midnight when the storm reached its worst, wind screaming between the towers hard enough to rattle the iron gate on its hinges, and it was then that Wren stood. She did not shout. She did not beg. She walked to the very edge of the torchlight, where the guards could see her clearly, and she held out her hand, palm up, fingers open, empty of any weapon, empty of any trick. It was a healer's gesture, the one she used with frightened patients and cornered animals alike, a way of saying, "I mean you no harm. I am not here to take anything from you." She held it there in the rain and did not lower it. The guards exchanged uncertain looks. One of them finally broke away and disappeared into the keep, muttering that someone had better decide what to do about the mad woman at the gate, before she froze to death and became a problem for all of them. Wren did not know it yet, but the man who received that message was not a steward or a captain of the guard. It was Edmund Voss, the king's closest attendant, a quiet, watchful man who had served Alaric Vane since before the tragedy that had changed everything. Edmund listened to the guard's description, an outsider woman, refusing to leave, holding out her hand in the storm like she expected someone to take it, and something in the description made him set down his pen and rise from his chair. He found the king exactly where he always was at this hour, standing at the window of the high tower, looking out over the dark mountains with an expression that had not changed in 10 years. Alaric Vane stood taller than most men in his court, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair he kept cropped close, and eyes the pale gray of a winter sky. He had ruled the northern pack since he was 23 years old, and for the last 10 of those years, no living soul had seen him shift into his wolf. It was the strangest fact about him, whispered in every corner of the kingdom, and never spoken aloud in his presence. An alpha king who did not run with his own pack under the full moon, who never joined the great hunts, who sat, human and still, through ceremonies where every other wolf in the hall shifted and howled in celebration. No one knew why. No one dared ask. "There's a woman at the gate," Edmund said carefully. "She's been there for hours, refuses to leave until she sees you." "Send her away," Alaric said, without turning from the window. She says her village is dying. A sickness in the water. That got his attention. Alaric's shoulders went rigid, just slightly. A tension so brief that anyone who did not know him as well as Edmund did would have missed it entirely. He turned from the window, and for a moment his pale eyes held something raw and old, something that had nothing to do with the woman at the gate, and everything to do with a night 10 years gone, a night neither of them ever spoke of. Poisoned water, Alaric said slowly. That's what she claims. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, jaw tight, and Edmund knew better than to press him. Finally the king said, "Bring her in, not to the throne room. My study." By the time Ren was led inside, she had been standing in the storm for nearly 5 hours, and her whole body trembled with cold, though she refused the blanket a servant offered, insisting there was no time to waste on comfort. She was brought down a long corridor lined with old banners, past guards who stared at her with open curiosity, and finally into a warm study lit by a low fire, where a man stood waiting with his back to the door. When he turned to face her, Ren did not bow. She did not lower her eyes the way she had been warned every visitor must. She simply looked at him, taking in the exhaustion carved into his face, the stillness that seemed less like calm and more like a man holding himself together through sheer will, and she said, "Thank you for seeing me." Alaric studied her for a long moment. Most people who stood before him trembled, or postured, or tried too hard to appear unafraid. This woman did none of those things. She simply waited, soaked to the skin, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she stood before the most powerful man in the north. "You held out your hand at my gate for 5 hours," he said. "Why?" "Because I needed someone to notice," Ren said. "And because it's what I do when I want someone to trust me. An open hand can't hide a weapon. I'm not afraid of weapons." "I didn't think you were," Ren said. "I think you're afraid of something else, but that's not why I'm here." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Tell me about your village." Ren did not waste time on pleasantries. She described the sickness in careful, precise detail, the way it started with fatigue and a metallic taste in the mouth, the way it progressed to trembling hands and clouded eyes, the way 3 people had already died and a dozen more would follow within the month if nothing changed. She described the well at the center of the village, how the water had turned faintly yellow in the last 2 weeks, how the sheep who drank from the stream nearby had begun dying, strangely fast. Alaric listened without interrupting, but as she spoke, his expression grew darker, more distant, until finally he turned away from her and gripped the edge of his desk hard enough that his knuckles went pale. "Yellow water," he said quietly. "A metallic taste, trembling hands." "You've seen this before," Ren said. It was not a question. He did not answer her directly. Instead, he said, "I will send physicians, supplies, clean water, enough to last your village through the winter." "That's not enough," Ren said. "I need to know what's causing it, or in 2 months we'll be back where we started. I need someone who understands the old poisons, the ones that don't show themselves right away." "I understand them," Alaric said, so quietly she almost missed it. "Better than anyone alive." Ren studied him, this cold, guarded king, who had gone still and pale at the mere description of a sickness she had walked 4 days through a storm to escape, and for the first time, since she had arrived, she felt something other than desperation. She felt the stirring of a question she could not yet answer, a suspicion that the wound in her village, and the wound in this man's past, were somehow the same shape. "Then come with the physicians," she said. "Come see it yourself." It was not a request any advisor would have dared make, and Edmund, standing near the door, drew a sharp breath at her boldness. Alaric turned back to her slowly, and for a long moment the fire crackled in the silence between them. "No one asks me to leave this keep," he said. "Not anymore." "I'm not asking because I know the rules," Ren said. "I'm asking because my people are dying, and you're the only man who looked like he understood why the moment I described it." Alaric's jaw worked once, twice, and something in his rigid composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Ren to see the shadow of the man beneath the king. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I will ride with the convoy myself," he said, "at dawn." Edmund's eyes widened in open shock, but Alaric did not look at him. He was looking at Ren, at the exhausted, soaked, unshaking woman who had stood in his storm for 5 hours and asked him for the one thing no one in 10 years had dared to ask of him, to leave the safety of his walls and face something that frightened him. Ren did not know yet what had silenced his wolf a decade ago. She did not know that somewhere in the depths of this keep, a man named Draven was, at that very moment, hearing the same report of yellow water and trembling hands, and feeling his blood run cold with a fear far older and far more dangerous than any storm. All Ren knew was that the Alpha King had just agreed to ride into danger for a village he had never seen, for a woman he had known less than an hour, and that whatever secret lived behind his pale, haunted eyes, she intended to find it before it cost her people, or him, everything they had left. Before Ren left the study, Edmund guided her to a small chamber near the kitchens, where a fire had been built up and dry clothes laid out for her. She sat by the flames and let the warmth work its way back into her bones, and for the first time in 4 days, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. A servant girl named Beatrice brought her bread and broth, and lingered a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You spoke to the king," Beatrice said, half a question, half disbelief. "In his study, alone." "I did," Ren said. "No one does that," Beatrice whispered. "Not since Lady Corwin died. He hasn't let anyone close in 10 years. Not really close." She caught herself, as if she had said too much, and busied herself with the fire instead of finishing the thought. Ren did not press her. She had learned long ago that grief revealed itself in its own time, and that pushing too hard only closed doors that might otherwise open on their own. But the name stayed with her, turning over and over in her mind as she finally allowed her eyes to close. Lady Corwin. Whoever she had been, her death seemed to sit at the center of everything unspoken in this keep. A stone dropped into still water long ago, its ripples still moving outward even now. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses being readied in the courtyard below. From her window she could see torches moving in orderly lines, saddles being checked, supply carts loaded with sacks of grain, and sealed jars of medicine. At the center of it all stood Alaric, already dressed for the road, speaking in low tones to a cluster of soldiers who nodded and dispersed at his words. He looked, Ren thought, like a man bracing himself for something far worse than a long ride through the cold. There was a tightness in his shoulders that had nothing to do with the weather, and when one of the younger soldiers said something that made the others laugh, Alaric did not so much as glance in their direction. He stood apart from his own men, as he seemed to stand apart from everything, a king surrounded by his kingdom and entirely alone within it. By the time Ren made her way down to the courtyard, the sky had turned the pale gray of early morning, and the storm clouds had finally broken apart, revealing thin ribbons of light along the horizon. Edmund met her at the base of the stairs, holding the reins of a sturdy brown mare. "She's gentle," he said. "You'll want gentle, for the pace we're keeping." "How fast will we move?" "Faster than is wise for men who haven't slept," Edmund said, glancing toward Alaric, "but he won't hear otherwise. Once he decides something, that's the end of the discussion." Ren mounted the mare and looked toward the king, who was checking the straps on his own horse with more attention than the task required, the way people busy their hands when their minds are somewhere they would rather not be. She thought again of the yellow water, the trembling hands, the way his whole body had gone rigid at her description, and she wondered how many mornings he had woken like this, bracing himself against a memory he refused to name. "Ready?" Alaric asked, not looking at her, swinging up into his saddle in one smooth motion. "Ready," Ren said. He gave a single sharp command, and the convoy began to move, wheels creaking, hooves striking frozen mud, torches finally being doused as the daylight strengthened around them. Ren fell into pace beside him, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the only sound between them the rhythm of hooves and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the tree line. It was Ren who broke the silence, because she had never been very good at leaving a wound unexamined once she had glimpsed it. "You didn't ride out here for the medicine," she said. "You could have sent physicians and stayed behind the walls, like you always do." Alaric's jaw tightened. "You noticed that." "I notice most things. It's the only skill I have that's worth anything." He was quiet for a long stretch of road, long enough that Ren thought he might refuse to answer at all. Then, finally, in a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the wind, he said, 10 years ago, there was another village. Different name, same symptoms. I was too late to stop what happened there, and I have spent every day since making certain nothing like it happens again on my watch. What happened? His eyes fixed on the road ahead, pale and distant. Ask me again when we reach your village, he said. I'd rather show you the truth than speak it before I'm certain. Ren did not push further, though the answer sat uneasily in her chest, a puzzle piece that did not yet fit anywhere she could see. She thought of Beatrice's whispered words, Lady Corwin, of the tower window that burned with lamplight long after every other light in the keep went dark, and she understood, without yet knowing the shape of it, that she had stumbled into something far larger than a sick village and a dying well. The convoy pressed on through the thinning light, north toward the mountains, north toward home, and behind them, in a chamber deep within the keep, Councillor Draven read the same report of yellow water and trembling hands that had reached the king hours before, and his hands, when he set the parchment down, were shaking far worse than the weather could explain. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break, and the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains like a promise neither of them had yet agreed to keep. The scream came from the front of the convoy before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, and Alaric was off his horse before the sound had even finished echoing off the rocks. A young soldier named Garrick had gone ahead to scout the narrow mountain pass, and now he stumbled back toward the group with his arm hanging wrong at the shoulder, blood soaking through his sleeve, his face white with shock. Behind him, 3 rogue wolves emerged from the tree line, larger than any pack animal had a right to be, their eyes glinting with a hunger that had nothing to do with simple survival. Formation, Alaric barked, and the soldiers around him snapped into motion, forming a rough circle around the supply carts, weapons drawn. Ren's mare reared in fright, and she fought to keep her seat, her mind racing through every account she had ever heard of rogue packs, wolves cast out from their own territories, feral and unpredictable, driven by something closer to madness than hunger. Get behind the carts, Alaric said to her, low and urgent, already moving toward the front of the formation. I can help. I have herbs, bindings. Behind the carts, he said again, and this time there was no room for argument in his voice. Ren obeyed, though every instinct in her healer's mind screamed against retreating, while a man lay bleeding in the open. She watched from behind the wooden slats as the rogue wolves circled the convoy, testing the soldiers' formation, looking for weakness. There were more than 3, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach. 5, maybe 6, moving through the trees at the edges of her vision, patient in a way that felt deliberate rather than animal. The first wolf lunged, and the soldiers met it with spears, driving it back with a snarl of pain, but the diversion had done its work. 2 more wolves broke from the tree line at the convoy's flank, where the formation was thinnest, and Ren watched in horror as one of the young soldiers went down beneath a wolf twice his size. Alaric moved then, faster than Ren had ever seen a man move, closing the distance in 3 long strides and driving his blade into the attacking wolf's shoulder before it could finish what it started. But the wolves had numbers on their side, and more kept emerging from the trees, drawn by the scent of blood, until Ren counted 8 distinct shapes circling the convoy like a noose slowly tightening. We can't hold this line, one of the soldiers shouted, and Ren heard the truth in his voice, the particular fear of men who knew they were outmatched, and had no better option than to keep fighting anyway. It was Edmund, who said what everyone else was thinking, but afraid to voice. Your Majesty, you have to shift. Alaric did not answer. His blade caught another attacking wolf across the flank, driving it back with a yelp of pain, but his jaw was locked tight, his whole body rigid with something that looked less like battle focus, and more like a man fighting a war within himself, as fierce as the one around him. Alaric, Edmund said again, sharper this time, dropping formality entirely. We will not survive this, as men alone. Ren, watching from behind the carts, understood then what she had only suspected before. This was not simple stubbornness or royal pride, keeping the king from shifting. Something in him had built a wall so thick around his wolf that even the threat of death could not break through it, and she watched, helpless, as a 9th wolf slipped past the soldier's failing line and turned its attention toward the supply carts. Toward her. The wolf's eyes locked onto hers through the gaps in the wooden slats, and Ren felt every muscle in her body go cold with the specific, animal terror of being hunted. She had no weapon, no training in combat, only the small belt knife she used for cutting bandages and herbs, useless against a creature built entirely for killing. The wolf gathered itself to leap, and Ren had just enough time to think, absurdly, that she had come all this way only to die before ever reaching her village, when a sound tore through the clearing that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a scream. It was not the clash of swords or the snarl of a wolf. It was Alaric. Something in him broke, finally, violently. 10 years of restraint shattering in a single instant, and where a man had stood a heartbeat before, there was now a wolf, larger than any Ren had ever seen, black as the space between stars, with pale gray eyes that burned with an old, deep grief, even in the chaos of battle. He moved between Ren and the attacking wolf so fast the air itself seemed to bend around him, and the rogue wolf that had meant to kill her went down beneath him with a single, brutal motion that ended the fight before it truly began. The remaining rogues, seeing their numbers cut down and their prey turn suddenly, catastrophically outmatched, broke and fled into the tree line, and within moments the clearing fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of soldiers and the distant crash of retreating wolves through the underbrush. Alaric stood over the fallen rogue for a long moment, his black fur soaked through with blood that was not his own, his massive form trembling, and when he finally lifted his head and looked at Ren, she saw something in his wolf's eyes that no words could have carried. Old, unhealed grief, wrapped so tightly around 10 years of silence, that even now, even having just saved her life, he looked less like a victor, and more like a man forced to relive the worst moment of his existence. Ren stepped out from behind the cart slowly, her hands trembling, and she did not run from him, did not flinch from the size of him, or the blood on his coat. She simply walked forward, the same way she had held out her hand at his gate 3 days before, and knelt down in front of him until they were eye to eye. "Thank you," she said quietly. The wolf's ears flattened, and for a moment, Ren thought he might turn and vanish into the trees the way the rogues had fled. Instead, he lowered his great head until his muzzle nearly touched her outstretched palm, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, and held there, trembling, as if the simple act of being near another person without violence between them was almost more than he could bear. Around them, the soldiers had gone completely still, staring at their king in a form none of them had seen in a decade, and Edmund, blood-spattered and breathing hard, lowered his weapon and simply watched, his expression somewhere between relief and heartbreak. It was Garrick, the young scout with the wounded arm, who finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse with disbelief. 10 years, he whispered. 10 years, and here he is. Slowly, the black wolf drew back, and in the space of a breath he was a man again, kneeling in the mud before Ren, chest heaving, his pale eyes wet with something he did not try to hide. He did not speak. He simply knelt there, hollowed out by the effort of what he had just done, and Ren reached out and placed her hand against his shoulder, the same gesture she had offered at the gate, an open hand asking nothing and offering everything. "You saved my life," she said. "I should have done that 10 years ago," Alaric said, so quietly it was almost lost in the wind. "For someone else. I wasn't fast enough then." Ren did not ask him to explain. She simply stayed beside him as the soldiers moved to tend the wounded and gather the fallen, and she felt, for the first time since she had arrived at his gate, that the wall around this man had cracked open just wide enough to let something new through. They made camp early that night, the convoy too shaken to press on toward the pass in darkness, and Ren spent the evening treating Garrick's shoulder and the minor wounds of the other soldiers, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a healer who had done this 100 times before, though her mind kept drifting back to the black wolf standing over her, and the grief in eyes that had not been human. Later, as the fire burned low, and most of the camp had settled into uneasy sleep, Ren found Alaric sitting apart from the others, staring into the flames, with the same distant expression she had first seen in his study. "Who was she?" Ren asked, settling down across from him. "The person you couldn't save." Alaric's eyes lifted to hers, and for a long moment she thought he would refuse to answer, the way he had refused every other question about his past. But something about the night, about the blood still drying on his coat and the wolf still close beneath his skin, seemed to have worn away his usual defenses. "Her name was Corwin," he said. "She was going to be my queen." Ren said nothing at first, letting the silence hold space for whatever came next, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, a hawk called out once and fell silent, as if even the mountain itself was listening. "You don't have to tell me the rest," she said finally. "I didn't ask to open an old wound." "You didn't open it," Alaric said. "It's been open for 10 years. You're the first person who's made me look at it instead of walking past." He picked up a stick and turned it slowly in his hands, not looking at her now, looking instead at the fire, as if the flames made it easier to speak. "Corwin came from a border pack, much like yours. Her father was a minor lord with more debts than land. She wasn't raised for court, and she never pretended to be anything she wasn't. I loved that about her before I understood how rare it was." "What happened to her?" "There was a sickness," he said, and Ren felt her stomach tighten, already guessing the shape of what was coming. "It started in a village 2 days from here. Fatigue, a metallic taste, trembling hands, the same symptoms you described to me in my study, word for word. And when you said them, I felt the floor drop away beneath me." "The water was poisoned," Ren said quietly. "Yes, deliberately, though it took months to prove it. By the time we understood what was happening, half the village was already dead, and Corwin, who insisted on going to help despite every warning I gave her, was among them." His voice did not break, but it went very still, the stillness of a man who had rehearsed this story so many times in silence that saying it aloud felt like a betrayal of the silence itself. "I was 3 hours away when she fell ill. 3 hours, and by the time I reached her, there was nothing left to save." Ren reached across the space between them and rested her hand against his forearm, not to comfort him with words, which felt insufficient, but simply to remind him that he was not alone in the telling of it. "That's why you stopped shifting. My wolf wanted to run to her the moment I heard she was sick. Every instinct in me screamed to move faster, to reach her before it was too late, and I couldn't. I was too far. My legs, my human legs, weren't fast enough, and I have never forgiven myself for not shifting the moment I heard the news, instead of wasting time on the road as a man." He set the stick down and finally looked at her, his pale eyes bright with old grief. "After she died, I couldn't bear to feel that fast, that powerful, and still not be able to save the one person I most wanted to save. So I stopped. I told myself it was easier to be slow and grieving than fast and helpless." "That's not weakness," Ren said. "That's the deepest kind of grief there is." "It's cost me 10 years of being half of what I was born to be," he said. "My pack has followed a king who couldn't run beside them under the full moon. My sister has watched me become a stranger in my own skin. And today, I almost let that same stubborn silence get you killed, because some part of me still believed that staying human, staying slow, was a kind of penance I owed her." "What changed?" Ren asked. "Today, in the clearing. What made you finally shift?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had dropped low enough that she had to lean closer to hear him over the crackle of the fire. "I looked at that wolf, lunging toward you, and for one terrible second, I saw Corwin's face instead of yours. And I understood, all at once, that if I let that same slowness cost another life, I would never survive knowing it twice." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for, and Ren found she had no easy words to offer in return. She simply stayed where she was, her hand still resting against his arm, and let the fire burn lower between them, while the rest of the camp slept on, unaware that something long buried had finally begun, however painfully, to come back into the light. Above them, the clouds finally parted enough to reveal a thin sliver of moon, and Alaric glanced up at it, with an expression Ren had not yet seen on his face, something that was not quite peace, but was, perhaps, the first small step toward it. "We should reach the pass by midday tomorrow," he said, his voice steadying, the king reasserting himself over the grieving man. "Your village is another half-day beyond that." "Then we should sleep," Ren said, though neither of them moved to do so right away. "Ren," he said, before she could rise, "thank you for not looking at me differently, now that you know." "I already knew you were carrying something heavy," she said. "Now I just know its shape." He held her gaze a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them in the firelight, and then, at last, they both settled into an uneasy rest, the camp quiet around them, the mountain wind carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke toward the pass that would lead them, by morning, one step closer to the truth neither of them yet fully understood. The pass collapsed behind them, without warning. A wall of rock and snow crashing down across the trail they had ridden through only minutes before, and Ren's mare screamed in panic as the ground itself seemed to shudder beneath its hooves. "Move!" Alaric shouted, already turning his horse toward the narrow gap still open ahead of the slide, and the convoy surged forward in a chaos of shouting men and rearing animals, boulders the size of houses, tumbling down the mountainside behind them, with a roar that swallowed every other sound. Ren clung to her mare's neck as the animal bolted forward on instinct, dust and debris filling the air, and for one terrifying moment, she lost sight of Alaric entirely, swallowed by the cloud of rock dust that had engulfed the pass. When the roar finally settled into an uneasy silence, she twisted in her saddle and saw him, coated gray with dust, pulling his horse to a stop beside a fallen supply cart, checking each soldier in turn with quick, efficient movements. "Is everyone accounted for?" he called out, and one by one the soldiers confirmed themselves, shaken but alive, until only Garrick's voice was missing from the count. "Garrick," Edmund called, scanning the ridge, and it was Ren who spotted him first, pinned beneath the edge of the collapsed supply cart, his newly bandaged shoulder trapped at an angle that made her stomach twist. She was off her horse before anyone could stop her, moving to his side, with the same steady focus she brought to every patient, assessing the damage, even as she called for 2 soldiers to help lift the cart free. "Don't move him yet," she said sharply, when one of the men tried to pull Garrick out too quickly. "If his leg is broken, moving him wrong could make it worse." Alaric knelt on the other side of the cart, his hands finding purchase on the splintered wood, and together with 2 soldiers, he lifted it just enough for Ren to slide Garrick free, her hands moving quickly along his leg to check for breaks, her expression calm, even as the young soldier gasped in pain. "It's not broken," she said finally, relief evident in her voice. "Bruised badly, and he'll need to stay off it, but it's not broken." Garrick let out a shaky breath, and around him, the soldiers exchanged looks of quiet relief, the tension of the last several minutes finally beginning to ease. It was only then that Alaric turned to study the collapsed pass behind them, his expression shifting from relief into something far more suspicious. "That slide wasn't natural," he said. Edmund moved to stand beside him, following his gaze up toward the ridge where the rockfall had originated. "You think someone caused it. I think it happened at the exact moment we were passing through the narrowest point of the trail," Alaric said. "That's not coincidence, that's timing." Ren, still crouched beside Garrick, felt a cold unease settle over her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Who would want to stop us from reaching the village?" Alaric did not answer immediately. Instead, he climbed a short distance up the ridge, studying the pattern of the rockfall with the careful eye of a man who had spent years learning to read the land he ruled, and when he came back down, his jaw was set in a hard, grim line. "There are marks here," he said. "Tool marks, in the stone above the slide point. Someone weakened this section deliberately, and recently. Days, not years." "Draven," Edmund said quietly, and though it was barely more than a breath, Ren caught the name and filed it away with the same careful attention she gave to every unexplained symptom in a difficult patient. "You said that name once before," Ren said. "In the keep. Who is he?" "My counselor," Alaric said. "One of the few men who was with me the night Corwin died. He has served my family for 20 years. He paused, something working behind his eyes that looked less like suspicion and more like a reluctant, painful reconsideration of a trust he had never before questioned. "I don't yet know why his name keeps surfacing in my thoughts, only that it does, and that I don't like what that might mean." They pressed on through the remainder of the day, at a slower, more cautious pace. Scouts sent ahead to check the trail before the main convoy followed, and Ren found herself watching Alaric with new eyes, noting the way his gaze now swept the tree line constantly, the way his hand rested near his blade, even when the road ahead looked empty and calm. It was near dusk when they finally crested the last ridge before her village, and Ren felt her heart seize at the sight below them. Smoke rose from several chimneys, thin and gray against the darkening sky, but the fields that should have been alive with evening activity, children finishing chores, farmers bringing in livestock, stood empty and still, as if the entire village had gone quiet all at once. "Something's wrong," Ren said, urging her mare faster, despite Alaric's call of caution behind her. And she did not slow until she reached the edge of the village square, where a small cluster of villagers stood gathered around a single figure lying motionless on the ground. It was Hollis, the old builder who had carried half the village on his back through every hard winter for 30 years, and even from a distance, Wren could see that his chest was not rising. "No," she breathed, sliding from her horse before it had fully stopped, pushing through the gathered villagers to kneel at his side. His skin had gone the same gray pallor she remembered from the worst cases before she left, his lips tinged faintly blue, and though she pressed her fingers to his throat searching desperately for a pulse, she already knew, with the certainty of a healer who had seen too much death to mistake it for anything else, that she was too late. The villagers around her wept quietly, and Wren felt her own grief rise up hot and fierce, tangled together with a rage she had not expected. She had walked 4 days through a storm, convinced an Alpha King to leave his walls, survived rogue wolves and a collapsing mountain pass, and still she had not been fast enough. Alaric knelt beside her, his hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder, and though he said nothing, the gesture carried the full weight of a man who understood exactly what this particular failure felt like, because he had lived it himself, 10 years before, in a village not so different from this one. "How many more?" Wren asked, her voice rough, addressing the gathered villagers without looking up from Hollis's still form. "Petra," an older woman answered, her voice breaking. "She's still with us, but barely. The physician you sent word for hasn't arrived yet." Wren was on her feet before the woman finished speaking, moving toward Petra's house with the desperate speed of someone racing against a clock she could not see, and Alaric followed close behind her, calling for his own physicians to bring every remedy they carried. Inside the small house, Petra lay pale and trembling on a narrow bed, her mother kneeling beside her, with the particular stillness of someone who had already begun preparing herself for the worst. Wren dropped to her knees at the girl's side, checking her pulse, her breathing, the color beneath her nails, running through every possibility in her mind with the speed of long practice. "She's still fighting," Wren said finally, relief cutting through the tightness in her chest. "Bring the clean water, and the charcoal filtering herbs from my satchel, quickly." The physicians Alaric had brought moved into motion at her direction, and for the next several hours, Wren worked alongside them without pause, cleaning wounds, administering remedies, watching over Petra's small, fragile form, with a focus so total that she barely registered Alaric standing quietly in the doorway, watching her work, with an expression she did not have time to name. It was near midnight, when Petra's fever finally broke, and her breathing steadied into something closer to normal sleep, that Wren finally allowed herself to sit back on her heels and breathe, exhaustion crashing over her all at once. "She'll live," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "Because of you," Alaric said quietly, from the doorway. Wren turned to look at him, at the dust and grief and quiet steadiness in his expression, and for the first time since Hollis's death, she felt a small, fragile flicker of hope return to her chest. "We were too late for some," she said, "but not for her. Then we make certain we're not too late for the rest," Alaric said, and something in the firm resolve of his voice told her that whatever answers waited in the poisoned well outside the village, he intended to find them before the sun rose again. Wren stepped outside into the cool night air, needing a moment away from the close warmth of the sick room, and found the village square quieter now. The earlier chaos settled into the low murmur of people keeping vigil over their sick. A young woman named Nora, who had been one of Wren's closest friends since childhood, approached her with a cup of warm broth and a face lined with worry, far beyond her years. "You brought him," Nora said, glancing toward the house, where Alaric now stood, speaking quietly with his physicians. "The Alpha King himself. I didn't think you'd manage it." "I didn't think so either," Wren admitted, accepting the broth gratefully. "How long has it been this bad?" 3 more fell sick after you left," Nora said. "Hollis held on longer than anyone expected. He kept saying he wouldn't go until you came back with help." Her voice cracked, and Wren reached out to steady her, the 2 women holding on to each other for a moment in the cold night. "I should have moved faster," Wren said. "You walked through a storm for 4 days, and convinced a king to leave his own walls," Nora said fiercely. "There was no faster." Wren did not entirely believe her, but she let the words settle regardless, needing something to hold on to against the grief pressing at the edges of her composure. Across the square, She watched Alaric emerge from Petra's house and pause, looking toward the well at the center of the village, with an expression of such focused intensity that Nora noticed it too. "He looks like a man hunting something," Nora said quietly. "He is," Ren said. "We both are." She left Nora with the promise of returning soon, and crossed the square to where Alaric stood, his eyes fixed on the stone well that had served her village for 3 generations, now the suspected source of everything that had gone wrong. Up close, she could see the same rigid tension in his shoulders that she had noticed the night he first agreed to ride with the convoy, the tension of a man forcing himself to look directly at something that reminded him of his worst memory. "You don't have to examine it tonight," she said. "It will still be there in the morning, and you've had a hard enough day. If I wait until morning, I'll spend the whole night imagining what we might find," Alaric said. "I would rather know now." Together they approached the well, and Alaric knelt at its edge, drawing up a bucket of water and studying it in the moonlight, with a careful, methodical attention that surprised Ren, given how she had first assumed his knowledge of poisons was born only from tragedy, rather than genuine study. The water carried the same faint yellow tinge she had described to him days before, and when he dipped a finger into it and brought it briefly to his tongue, his expression turned instantly grim. "Metallic," he said, "just like before." Before, meaning 10 years ago. "Exactly like 10 years ago," he said, setting the bucket down carefully, "which means either this is a natural contamination that happens to mirror an old tragedy with impossible precision, or someone has done this deliberately, using the same method twice." "Why would anyone poison 2 villages a decade apart?" Ren asked. "That," Alaric said, rising to his feet, his pale eyes hard in the moonlight, "is exactly what I intend to find out before I return home." They stood together at the edge of the well for a long moment, the village quiet around them, grief and exhaustion hanging heavy in the night air, and Ren found herself grateful, in a strange and unexpected way, for the steady presence of the man beside her. Whatever answers waited in the days ahead, she no longer felt as though she was searching for them alone. "Get some rest," Alaric said finally, noticing the exhaustion she had been trying to hide. "I'll have my physicians take the next watch over Petra. You've done more than enough for one night." "And you?" Ren asked. "I doubt I'll sleep," he admitted, "but I'll rest easier, knowing you have." Ren allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first since arriving back in her village, and made her way toward Nora's house for what little rest the night still offered, while behind her, Alaric remained at the well's edge, staring into the dark water as though it might, if he looked long enough, finally give up the secret it had carried for 10 long years. Petra woke screaming just before dawn, clawing at her own throat as if something invisible had its hands wrapped around it, and Ren was across the room before the girl's mother had even risen from her chair. "Petra, look at me," Ren said sharply, catching the girl's flailing hands and holding them still. "You're safe. Breathe with me." It took several long moments before Petra's wild eyes finally focused on Ren's face, her breathing slowing from ragged gasps into something more even, though her small body still trembled with the aftermath of whatever nightmare had gripped her. "The water," Petra whispered. "I saw the well. There was a man standing over it in the dark, pouring something in." Ren went very still. "A dream or a memory?" "I don't know," Petra said, tears slipping down her pale cheeks. "I saw it before I got sick. I thought it was a dream then too, but now I keep seeing his face. Can you describe him?" Petra's brow furrowed with the effort of a memory that clearly frightened her more than she could put into words. Tall, thin. He wore the king's colors, but not like a soldier, like someone important. He had a scar here. She touched a trembling finger to her own jaw, tracing a line from ear to chin. Ren's blood turned cold. She had seen exactly that description once already, in a passing conversation with one of Alaric's soldiers during the ride north. A soldier who had mentioned, almost in passing, that Counselor Draven carried an old scar along his jaw from a training accident in his youth. She found Alaric outside within minutes, his expression sharpening into focused attention the moment she relayed what Petra had told her. "A scar along the jaw," he repeated slowly. "Tall, thin, wearing my colors." "You already suspected him," Ren said. "This isn't proof, but it isn't nothing either." "No," Alaric agreed, his voice hard. "It isn't nothing. He turned to Edmund, who had followed close behind. "Send word back to the keep. I want every record from 10 years ago, the investigation into Corwin's village, brought here immediately. And find out where Draven has been these last 2 weeks." Edmund nodded and moved quickly to arrange riders, and Ren watched Alaric's expression as he stared toward the well. The same rigid tension from the night before now sharpened into something closer to controlled fury. "If it is him," Ren said carefully, "why would he do this? What could he possibly gain from poisoning 2 villages a decade apart?" "That's what troubles me most," Alaric admitted. "Draven has served my family since before I was born. He mourned Corwin as deeply as I did, or so I believed. If he is responsible for what happened to her, then everything I thought I understood about the man closest to me for 20 years has been a lie." They spent the following hours organizing the village's response, Ren directing the distribution of clean water brought by the convoy, while Alaric's physicians worked through the remaining sick. And though exhaustion pulled at every corner of Ren's mind, she found a strange comfort in the steady rhythm of purposeful work. Each small victory, a fever breaking, a patient managing to eat again, chipping away at the grief still fresh from Hollis's death. It was in the early afternoon that a rider returned from the keep far sooner than expected, his horse lathered with the effort of hard travel, carrying a sealed message meant for Alaric alone. Ren watched from across the square as Alaric broke the seal and read, his face going through a slow, terrible transformation, confusion giving way to disbelief, and disbelief hardening finally into something cold and unshakable. "What is it?" she asked, crossing to him quickly. "The records from 10 years ago," Alaric said, his voice flat with the particular calm of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "They're gone. Every document related to the investigation into Corwin's village has been removed from the archive. Not misplaced. Removed, deliberately, and recently." "Recently," meaning after word reached the keep about the sickness here. "Meaning within the last 3 days," Alaric said, meaning someone knew exactly what conclusions this new sickness would lead us toward, and moved quickly to make certain we couldn't compare it against what happened before. Ren felt the full weight of the implication settle over her. "Draven. He's the only one with access to that archive besides myself," Alaric said, "and the only one who would have reason to fear what those old records might reveal." That evening, as the village began to settle into an uneasy rest, Ren found Alaric standing apart from the camp, staring north toward the keep, with an expression she had come to recognize over the last several days, the particular stillness of a man forcing himself to remain calm, while everything within him screamed to act. "You want to ride back tonight?" she said, settling beside him. "I want to walk into that archive and demand answers from a man I have trusted my entire life," Alaric said. "But if I move too quickly, without proof, he'll simply deny everything and destroy whatever evidence remains. I need to be smarter than my anger, and that has never come easily to me." "Then we gather proof here first," Ren said. "If Petra saw what she says she saw, there may be traces at the well itself, something the physicians can identify even now." Alaric turned to look at her, something in his expression softening slightly despite the tension of the day. "You keep finding the steady path forward when I can only see the fastest one. That's because I spend my days keeping people alive one careful step at a time," Ren said. "You spend yours ruling a kingdom that expects you to move like thunder. We balance each other, apparently." A faint, tired smile crossed his face, the first she had seen since Hollis's death, and for a moment, the weight between them eased just slightly. 2 people bound together by grief and purpose, finding an unexpected comfort in each other's steadiness. They spent the following morning at the well with 2 of Alaric's physicians, examining the stone lining and the surrounding soil with careful attention, and it was Ren who finally noticed the faint residue clinging to the underside of the well's wooden cover, a fine gray powder that did not belong to any natural mineral she recognized. "This isn't from the ground," she said, showing the residue to the physicians, who examined it with growing concern. "This was added, recently, from the way it hasn't yet dissolved fully into the stone." One of the physicians, an older man named Ansel who had studied under the finest healers in the capital, took a careful sample and held it close to his lantern, his brow furrowing deeply. "I've seen something like this before," he said slowly, "in an old text on rare northern poisons. It's called wolfsbane ash, refined from a specific mountain root and processed in a manner that very few outside the royal apothecaries would know how to produce. Alaric's expression went very still. Who has access to the royal apothecaries? Very few, Ansel admitted. The head apothecary himself, his assistants, and those with direct authorization from the crown. Draven has that authorization, Alaric said quietly. He has had it for 15 years. The confirmation settled over the group like a physical weight, and Ren watched Alaric's hands curl into fists at his sides, 10 years of grief and confusion, finally beginning to sharpen into something with a clear and terrible shape. We have enough to act on now, Alaric said finally. Not enough to convict him before the full council, but enough to confront him and demand the truth. Then we ride back to the keep, Ren said. You don't have to come, Alaric said, though something in his voice suggested he hoped she would anyway. Your work here isn't finished. My work here is stabilizing, Ren said, but if the man responsible for poisoning my village is the same man who poisoned Corwin's, then I want to be there when the truth finally comes out. I owe that much to Hollis, and to everyone he tried to save before you arrived. Alaric held her gaze for a long moment, and Ren saw something shift behind his pale eyes, gratitude mixed with a quiet, growing warmth that neither of them had yet found the words to name. Then we ride together, he said, and we find out exactly how deep this betrayal runs. Before they left, Ren insisted on one final visit to Petra's bedside, needing to see with her own eyes that the girl's recovery had truly taken hold, before she could ride away with any peace of mind. She found Petra sitting up against a stack of pillows, pale but alert, sipping broth under her mother's watchful eye. You're leaving, Petra said, setting down her cup, to go after the man from my dream. We think he's real, Ren admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed. And we think he's hurt more people than just us. Petra's small hand found Ren's, gripping it with more strength than her fragile frame suggested she still possessed. Be careful. In my dream, he wasn't afraid of getting caught. He was afraid of something else, something bigger than us. The words settled uneasily in Ren's chest, and she thought of them again as she packed her satchel for the return journey, wondering what a man capable of poisoning 2 villages a decade apart could possibly fear more than justice. She mentioned Petra's words to Alaric as they prepared their horses, and his expression darkened further. Bigger than us, he repeated. That could mean many things. A conspiracy larger than one man, someone he answers to, or something he believes he's protecting, that matters more to him than his own conscience. Do you have any idea what that might be? None, Alaric admitted, which frightens me more than if I did. They said their farewells to the village as the sun rose fully over the mountains, Nora embracing Ren tightly and making her promise to return the moment the truth was uncovered, and Garrick, still favoring his bruised leg but well enough to travel, insisted on riding with them despite Ren's protests that he should rest longer. I've come this far, Garrick said stubbornly. I'll see it through. The ride back toward the keep passed more swiftly than the journey out, the convoy lighter now with most of the medical supplies distributed among the villagers, and Ren found herself watching Alaric closely as the distance to the keep shortened, noting the way his composure grew more controlled and more brittle, in equal measure, the closer they drew to a confrontation neither of them could fully predict. You're worried he'll simply deny everything, she said, riding close beside him on the second day of travel. I'm worried he'll deny everything, and I'll believe him, Alaric admitted quietly. 20 years of trust doesn't unravel easily, even with evidence in hand. Some part of me still wants to find another explanation. Some way this isn't the betrayal it appears to be. That's not weakness, Ren said, echoing words she had offered him once before, beside a different fire on a different night. That's the cost of having trusted someone deeply enough to be hurt by the truth. Perhaps, Alaric said, but I can't afford that hesitation once we reach the keep. If Draven is responsible for this, he has already shown he'll act to protect his secret, weakening a mountain pass, destroying records, poisoning wells. I need to confront him with certainty, not doubt. Then let the evidence carry the certainty, Ren said. You don't have to feel nothing to act decisively. You just have to let what you know guide what you do, even while what you feel stays complicated underneath it. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that had grown increasingly difficult for Ren to read, something between admiration and a deeper, more careful consideration she did not yet have a name for. You have a talent for saying exactly what I need to hear, even when it isn't what I want to hear. A healer's habit, Ren said. Comfort without honesty doesn't actually help anyone heal. By the third evening, the keep's towers finally came into view against the darkening sky, and Ren felt her stomach tighten at the sight, aware that whatever waited within those walls would either confirm the worst of Alaric's fears, or complicate them in ways neither of them could yet anticipate. Beside her, Alaric's jaw was set in the same hard line she had first noticed the day she met him, though now, she understood the grief and determination beneath it, far better than she had that stormy night at his gate. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, as they made camp for the final night before reaching the keep. "Thank you for not letting me hide from this any longer. I might have spent another 10 years avoiding this truth if you hadn't held out your hand at my gate." "We're not finished yet," Ren said. "Let's find the truth first. You can thank me properly once we have it." He allowed himself a small, tired smile at that, and they settled into an uneasy rest beneath a sky finally clear of storm clouds, while ahead of them, at the keep, Counselor Draven paced the length of his private chamber, aware that the riders sent north carried far more than medicine, and that his carefully guarded secret was, for the first time in 10 years, dangerously close to unraveling. The keep's gates had barely closed behind the convoy, when Draven's steward intercepted them in the courtyard, his face pale and his hands trembling as he delivered his message. "Counselor Draven requests an urgent audience," the steward said. "He says it cannot wait until morning." Alaric exchanged a quick glance with Ren, something sharp and wary passing behind his pale eyes. "Then let's not keep him waiting," he said, and his tone carried none of the careful diplomacy he had shown at the start of this journey. They found Draven in the same study where Ren had first met the king, and the sight of him standing there, tall and thin, that familiar scar tracing along his jaw exactly as Petra had described in her fevered vision, sent a cold certainty through Ren's chest that no amount of evidence could have delivered so completely. "Your Majesty," Draven said, bowing low, though his voice carried a tension that betrayed the calm formality of the gesture. "I heard troubling reports from the north. A sickness, a collapsed pass. I came at once to offer whatever assistance the crown might need." "How generous," Alaric said, his voice deceptively even, especially considering the archive records concerning Corwin's village went missing at almost exactly the same time this new sickness was reported. Draven's composure did not break, not visibly, but Ren, trained by years of reading the smallest signs of distress in frightened patients, caught the barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, the faint tremor in the hand he raised to smooth his robes. "Missing records," he said carefully. "That's troubling news indeed. I'll order an immediate search of the archive." "There's no need," Alaric said. "We already know what those records would have shown. The same poison, the same method, wolfsbane ash, refined through the royal apothecaries, to which very few men in this keep have access." For the first time, something cracked in Draven's carefully maintained composure, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his features before he schooled his expression back into practiced neutrality. "You cannot possibly believe I had any part in this." "I don't want to believe it," Alaric said, and Ren heard the raw honesty beneath his controlled tone, the genuine grief of a man confronting a betrayal from someone he had trusted for 2 decades. "But a young girl in that village described a man matching your exact appearance, pouring something into their well, in the dead of night. And you are the only person besides myself with the authority to remove those archive records. A sick child's fevered imagination is not evidence," Draven said, his voice sharpening with the first real edge of desperation Ren had yet heard from him. "Perhaps not on its own," Alaric agreed. "But combined with everything else, it paints a picture I can no longer ignore." Draven's eyes darted, just briefly, toward the door, and Ren felt her whole body tense at the movement, some primal instinct recognizing the posture of a cornered animal, calculating its escape. "I have served your family faithfully for 20 years, Draven said, his voice rising. "I mourned Corwin as deeply as you did. How dare you accuse me of orchestrating her death?" "I haven't accused you of orchestrating it," Alaric said quietly, "only of poisoning the water that killed her, and killing again a decade later. I still don't know why. That's what I need you to tell me, Draven. Whatever this is, whatever you're protecting, it isn't worth what it's already cost." For a long, tense moment, Draven said nothing, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the king's shoulder, lost in some calculation Ren could not follow. Then, abruptly, He moved, shoving past Edmund toward the study's side door with a speed that caught everyone off guard. "Stop him," Alaric shouted, but Draven was already through the door and into the corridor beyond, moving with the desperate energy of a man who had run out of options. The chase that followed tore through the keep's quiet halls, servants scattering in confusion as Draven fled toward the lower levels, Alaric close behind him, with Edmund and 2 guards following at a hard run. Ren, unwilling to be left behind, followed as quickly as she could manage, her healer's satchel bouncing against her hip as she navigated the unfamiliar corridors by sound alone, following the shouts and pounding footsteps echoing off the stone walls. She caught up to the commotion in the keep's lower archive chamber, where Draven had barricaded himself against a heavy oak door, and where Alaric now stood on the other side, his palm flat against the wood, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine pleading beneath its authority. "Draven, this ends now, one way or another," Alaric called through the door. "If you run, my guards will find you before morning. If you fight, more people will be hurt. Whatever you're protecting, is it truly worth dying for?" Silence answered him for a long moment, and then, muffled through the heavy door, Draven's voice came, cracked and hollow in a way that made Ren's chest tighten with an unexpected pang of something almost like pity. "You don't understand what's at stake," he said. "If I tell you the truth, it won't just destroy me. It will destroy everything you believe about the people closest to you." "Then let me judge that for myself," Alaric said. "Open the door, Draven." Another long silence stretched between them, and Ren watched Alaric's shoulders rise and fall, with the effort of controlled patience, a man forcing himself to wait when every instinct screamed for immediate action. Finally, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding free broke the tension, and the door opened just enough to reveal Draven standing within, his earlier bravado entirely stripped away, replaced by something exhausted and defeated. "I never meant for Corwin to die," Draven said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was never supposed to happen. Everything since then, everything I've done to hide it, has been to protect the truth from destroying something far larger than my own guilt." "What truth?" Alaric demanded, stepping into the chamber, Ren following close behind him, her healer's instincts screaming at the sight of Draven's trembling hands and hollow, sleepless eyes. Draven looked up, meeting the king's gaze directly for the first time since the confrontation began, and what Ren saw in his expression was not the cold calculation of a villain caught in his scheme, but the raw, broken guilt of a man who had spent 10 years drowning slowly in a secret too heavy to carry and too dangerous to release. "Sit down," Draven said quietly. "Both of you. This will take some time to explain, and I owe you the whole truth now, whatever it costs me." Alaric hesitated only a moment before lowering himself into the chair across from his old advisor, and Ren took the seat beside him, her heart pounding with the certainty that whatever came next would reshape everything she thought she understood about the tragedy that had shaped this king's entire life. Draven pressed his palms flat against the table, steadying himself, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp defensiveness of moments before, replaced by something worn thin by years of carrying a weight alone. 10 years ago, I discovered that a faction within the southern packs was smuggling weakened wolfsbane compounds across the border, testing how much a pack could be poisoned before the sickness became detectable. They believed that if they could weaken the northern packs slowly enough, without ever being traced, they could eventually challenge your father's claim on the territory, without ever raising a single sword. "You knew about this, and said nothing," Alaric said, his voice tight with disbelief. "I discovered it only after Corwin's village had already been poisoned," Draven said quickly. "I swear to you, I had no part in that first tragedy. But when I traced the source of the poison back to a hidden supply route, I realized exposing it publicly would ignite a war between the packs that the North was not prepared to fight. Your father had died only 2 years before. You were young, newly crowned, still learning the weight of your own authority. I made a choice to bury the evidence and quietly dismantle the smuggling route myself, believing I could end the threat without exposing the kingdom to a conflict it could not survive." "And the records," Alaric said, "the ones that vanished from the archive days ago. I removed them the moment word reached me of a new sickness in the north," Draven admitted. "I panicked, believing the old smuggling network had somehow resurfaced, and I feared that if the connection between the two poisonings became public before I understood what was happening, it would unravel 10 years of careful, quiet work, keeping that threat contained." Ren studied him closely, searching for the lie beneath his words, but found instead the particular exhaustion of a man who had told himself the same justification so many times that it had become both his shield and his prison. "If you dismantled the smuggling route 10 years ago," she said slowly, "then who poisoned my village now?" Draven's expression darkened, and for the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flickered openly across his face. "That is what frightens me most," he said. "I believe the threat ended a decade ago. If someone has revived that same method now, using the same refined wolfsbane ash, then either I failed to eliminate the network completely, or someone new has learned the same methods independently and is testing the Northern Pact's defenses all over again." Alaric's hands curled into fists atop the table, his jaw working with barely restrained fury. "You hid a conspiracy against my kingdom for 10 years, allowed me to grieve Corwin believing her death was a random tragedy, and now you're telling me the same threat may still be active." "I made the choice I believed would protect the most lives," Draven said, his voice cracking. "I have paid for that choice every single day since, watching you retreat from your own wolf, watching this kingdom slowly lose the king it needed most, and knowing I could never explain why, without risking everything I had tried to prevent." The silence that followed was heavy enough that Ren could hear her own heartbeat, and she watched Alaric closely, aware that the man beside her was fighting a battle far more complicated than simple anger, grief and betrayal, and a desperate, aching need for the truth, all tangled together behind his controlled expression. "Who else knew?" Alaric finally asked. "No one," Draven said. "I acted alone, believing it was the only way to keep the secret contained. I see now how foolish that was. If I had trusted you with the truth 10 years ago, perhaps we would have found the remaining threads of that network, before they could be picked up again by someone new." "We need the names," Ren said quietly, speaking for the first time since Draven had begun his confession. "Everyone you suspected of involvement 10 years ago, every route you dismantled, every supplier you questioned. If this network has resurfaced, those old threads are the fastest way to trace it back to whoever revived it." Draven looked at her with something like grudging respect. "I have records," he admitted, "hidden separately from the official archive, precisely because I never trusted anyone else to see them without understanding the full context first. I can retrieve them within the hour." "Do it," Alaric said, his voice hard. "And Draven, understand this clearly. Whatever judgment you face for the choices you made 10 years ago will come later, and it will come. But right now, the priority is stopping whoever is behind this, before another village suffers what mine, and Corwin's, already have." Draven nodded slowly, rising from his seat with the heavy, deliberate movements of a man finally setting down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. As he moved toward the door to retrieve his hidden records, he paused, glancing back at the king he had served for 2 decades. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I am glad your wolf finally ran again. Corwin would have wanted that far more than she would have wanted 10 years of silence in her memory." The words seemed to land somewhere deep and unguarded in Alaric, and Ren watched his controlled expression falter just slightly before he nodded once, wordlessly, allowing Draven to leave the chamber under Edmund's watchful escort. When they were alone, Ren reached across the table and rested her hand over Alaric's clenched fist, feeling the tension slowly begin to ease beneath her touch. "That wasn't the answer either of us expected," she said softly. "No," Alaric agreed, his voice rough. "It's worse. Corwin didn't just die from a random tragedy. She died because of a war being fought in shadows, one I never even knew existed until tonight. And now we know it may still be happening," Ren said, "which means we still have a chance to stop it before it costs anyone else what it's already cost you." Alaric turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together with a quiet, grateful pressure that carried more meaning than either of them was yet ready to name aloud. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I'm grateful I'm not facing it the way I faced everything for the last 10 years, alone." Outside the chamber, the keep had fallen into a tense, uneasy quiet, servants whispering in corners about the counselor's confrontation with the king, while somewhere in the depths of the archive, Draven began the slow, careful work of unearthing 10 years of buried secrets, unaware that the network he believed he had dismantled had already set its sights on a new and far more dangerous target. The hidden records Draven retrieved filled 3 heavy chests, and Wren's hands ached from turning pages by candlelight long before the first gray hint of dawn touched the study windows. "Here," Ansel said, the physician having been brought in to help decipher the old chemical notations scattered throughout Draven's private files. He slid a yellowed ledger across the table, tapping a column of names written in careful, cramped handwriting. "This lists everyone Draven questioned during his investigation, 10 years ago. Suppliers, smugglers, minor nobles, suspected of financing the network." Alaric scanned the list, his jaw tightening with every name he recognized as still living, still present at court, still trusted within his own walls. "Most of these men are dead now, or exiled. But this one," he said, pressing a finger to a name near the bottom of the page, "is still serving in my own guard." Wren leaned closer to read the name. "Captain Holt. He commands the Eastern Watch," Alaric said slowly, memory clearly turning over details he had never before had reason to question. "He's served 12 years without a single mark against him. Steady, reliable. I trusted him enough to place him in charge of security for this very keep. 10 years ago, according to this ledger, Draven questioned him about unusual shipments passing through the Eastern Gate," Ansel said, running his finger down the entry. "The investigation was inconclusive. Draven noted here that Holt claimed ignorance, and there was no further evidence to pursue the matter." "Inconclusive is not the same as innocent," Wren said. Alaric rose from the table, pacing the length of the study with the restless energy of a man whose entire understanding of loyalty within his own walls had just cracked open. If Holt was involved 10 years ago and has remained in a position of trust ever since, he would have had every opportunity to quietly revive the network Draven believed he had destroyed. "We need more than an old, inconclusive entry in a ledger," Edmund said carefully, having remained largely silent through the long night of reading. "Accusing the captain of the Eastern Watch without solid proof could fracture trust throughout the Guard at exactly the moment you need it most united. Then we find the proof," Wren said, quietly, "before he has any reason to suspect we're looking." It was Wren's idea, born from years of diagnosing illnesses that hid behind misleading symptoms, to approach the investigation the way she approached a difficult patient, gathering small, seemingly unconnected details until a clear pattern finally emerged. She spent the following 2 days moving carefully through the keep, speaking with servants and soldiers under the guise of documenting supply routes for future medical shipments, listening far more than she spoke, and slowly assembling a picture that troubled her more with each new detail. Captain Holt, she learned, had taken several unexplained absences from his post over the past month, always coinciding with unusual shipments arriving through the Eastern Gate under his personal authorization. A young guard named Corin, eager to please and unaware of the significance of what he was sharing, mentioned that Holt had recently requested access to the Royal Apothecary stores for what he claimed were routine medical supplies, an odd request given that such matters typically fell to the keep's own physicians, rather than the captain of the guard. Wren brought each new detail to Alaric each evening, and together they built a case slowly, carefully, the way a healer builds toward a diagnosis, rather than the way a soldier charges toward a battle. On the third evening, Alaric received a report that made his expression turn instantly grave. Holt requested leave to visit family in the Southern Territories, Alaric said, showing Wren the message, departing at dawn tomorrow. That's convenient timing, Wren said, right after we began quietly investigating the Eastern Watch. Too convenient, Alaric agreed. If he suspects we're closing in, he may be planning to flee, or worse, to destroy whatever remaining evidence connects him to the network before we can act. That night, Alaric assembled a small, trusted group. Edmund, 2 guards personally loyal to the crown, rather than to Holt's command, and Wren, whose sharp eye for detail had proven invaluable throughout the investigation. Together they moved quietly toward the Eastern Watchtower, under cover of darkness, intending to search Holt's private quarters, before his planned departure at dawn. They found the captain's rooms unlocked and hastily abandoned, drawers left open, a small strongbox pried apart and emptied of whatever it had once contained. On the floor near the cold hearth, half burned in a fire that had clearly been extinguished in haste, Wren discovered a fragment of parchment covered in the same cramped, careful handwriting style Ansel had identified in Draven's old ledger, though the hand itself was different, younger, more hurried. "He's already fled," Alaric said grimly, examining the empty room. Not far, Ren said, carefully lifting the burned parchment fragment and studying what remained of the writing. This mentions a location. A meeting point, somewhere near the old mill on the eastern border, dated for tomorrow night. Alaric took the fragment from her hands, his expression hardening into the same focused intensity she had first seen the day the rogue wolves attacked their convoy. If Holt is meeting someone at that mill, it means the network is larger than one captain acting alone. It means whoever revived this conspiracy 10 years after Corwin's death is still out there, waiting. Then we go to that mill, Ren said, and we find out exactly who we're truly facing. Edmund shifted uneasily. Your Majesty, this could easily be a trap. If Holt suspects he's been discovered, leading you directly into an ambush would be the simplest way to eliminate the threat you pose. I'm aware of that risk, Alaric said, which is why we go prepared, and why Ren remains here, safely within the keep, while soldiers accompany me to the mill. No, Ren said immediately, the word leaving her before she had fully considered it, though she did not regret it once spoken. I've come too far to be left behind now. Whatever waits at that mill, I want to see it end. Alaric studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, the same quiet understanding that had grown steadily since the night she first held out her hand at his gate. You're as stubborn as the storm that brought you here, he said finally. I take that as a compliment, Ren said. Despite the tension of the moment, a faint, tired smile crossed his face, quickly replaced by the hard focus of a king, preparing to confront the conspiracy that had shaped the worst decade of his life. Then we leave at first light, he said, quietly, and prepared for whatever waits for us at that mill. As the group finally left Holt's abandoned quarters, Ren paused at the doorway, glancing back at the cold, empty room, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Whatever they found at that mill, she understood now that they were no longer simply chasing the echo of an old tragedy. They were walking directly toward whoever had orchestrated it all along, and toward an ending that neither grief nor careful investigation alone would be enough to survive. Back in the study, before the household had fully woken, Alaric summoned Draven once more, needing his old advisor's knowledge of the network's original structure, before riding out toward the mill. Draven arrived looking as though he had not slept at all, deep shadows beneath his eyes, and when he learned that Captain Holt had fled and left behind a burned message pointing toward a meeting at the old eastern mill, his face drained of what little color remained. The mill, Draven said quietly. I searched that location myself, 10 years ago. It was abandoned even then, though I always suspected it had once served as a storage point for the smuggled poison, before it was moved further north. You never confirmed that suspicion, Alaric said. I never found proof, Draven admitted. By the time I traced the network back that far, the trail had gone cold, and I made the decision to focus on dismantling what I could, rather than chasing every abandoned building in the Eastern Territories. He looked up, meeting Alaric's gaze with an expression of genuine, weary regret. If I had pushed harder then, perhaps none of this would be happening now. We can't change what you did or didn't do 10 years ago, Ren said, but you can help us now. Is there anything about that mill's layout, any hidden passages or defensive positions, that could help us approach safely? Draven considered the question carefully, then moved to a shelf near the window, retrieving an old, water-stained map that he unrolled across the table. The mill has a lower cellar, accessible from both the main structure and a hidden entrance near the old grain chute, close to the riverbank. If Holt is meeting someone there, they'll likely use the cellar for privacy. It's the only part of the building still structurally sound enough to gather in. Alaric studied the map with the focused intensity of a commander planning a battle, tracing possible approach routes with his finger, while Edmund and the 2 loyal guards leaned in to examine the layout alongside him. We'll split into 2 groups, Alaric said finally, one approaching from the main road, visible enough to draw attention, while a second group circles toward the riverbank entrance, catching whoever's inside from the position they least expect. I'll take the riverbank approach, Ren offered. Absolutely not, Alaric said, his voice sharp with a protectiveness he did not bother to disguise. That position carries the greatest risk of direct confrontation. You'll remain with the main group, where the soldiers can shield you if anything goes wrong. Ren wanted to argue, the same stubborn instinct that had kept her standing at his gate through hours of storm rising up within her, but she recognized, too, the genuine fear behind his insistence, and for once, she allowed practicality to outweigh her pride. Fine, she said, but I'm staying close enough to help the moment it's needed. I wouldn't have it any other way, Alaric said, and something in his tone carried more warmth than the tense circumstances of the morning should have allowed. They departed within the hour, moving swiftly and quietly through the eastern territories, the mill finally coming into view as the sun climbed toward its midpoint in a pale, cloud-streaked sky. The building stood exactly as Draven had described, half collapsed, its wooden beams weathered gray with age, the great wheel that had once turned along the riverbank now still and silent, choked with vines. Alaric raised a hand, signaling the group to slow, and Ren felt her heartbeat quicken as they drew closer, every instinct sharpening in anticipation of whatever waited within those crumbling walls. Whatever answers the mill held, she understood now that there would be no turning back once they crossed its threshold, and she found herself grateful, despite the danger ahead, that she had refused to be left behind at the keep. Edmund raised a fist, halting the group entirely, and pointed toward a thin trail of smoke rising from a broken window near the mill's rear wall. Someone had lit a small fire inside, recently enough that the smoke still curled dark and fresh against the pale morning sky. Alaric crouched low, studying the building's exterior for any sign of movement, and after a long, tense moment, he spotted a lone figure pacing near the main entrance, a young guard Ren did not recognize, his posture tense and watchful in the manner of a man standing lookout rather than resting. "That's not Holt," Alaric murmured, "which means he's brought reinforcements, or he's meeting someone who already had people stationed here." "Do we still split as planned?" Edmund asked quietly. "Yes," Alaric said, "but carefully. If there's a lookout posted, there may be others we haven't spotted yet." He turned to Ren, his expression softening just slightly despite the tension gripping the rest of his face. "Stay close to Edmund's group. Whatever happens inside, I need to know you're safe." "I will be," Ren said, though the words felt smaller than the promise behind them. "Just be careful yourself. I didn't survive a collapsing mountain pass and a wolf attack just to lose you to a burned-out mill." Something flickered in his pale eyes, gratitude and affection tangled together, in a way neither of them had yet found room to properly acknowledge amid the danger surrounding them. And then he turned, moving low and silent toward the riverbank path with two soldiers close behind him, while Ren remained with Edmund's group, watching the lone lookout pace back and forth, unaware that the mill's long-buried secrets were, at last, mere minutes from being dragged into the light. The lookout never saw Alaric coming until a gloved hand had already closed over his mouth, and a low, dangerous voice warned him against making a single sound. "Where is Holt?" Alaric breathed, against the young guard's ear, and the man's eyes widened with terror as he recognized the voice belonging to his king. "Cellar," the guard managed to whisper, trembling. "He's meeting someone. I don't know who. I was only told to watch the road." Alaric bound the guard's hands quickly and left him under the watch of one soldier, before signaling the rest to move toward the hidden riverbank entrance Draven had described. The passage was narrow and choked with old cobwebs, but it led exactly where the map had promised, down a set of crumbling stone steps, into a low cellar, lit by a single lantern, where two figures stood in quiet, urgent conversation. Captain Holt stood with his back to the entrance, his posture rigid with the particular tension of a man delivering unwelcome news. And across from him stood a woman Ren did not immediately recognize, cloaked and hooded despite the cellar's enclosed warmth, her voice carrying the clipped, aristocratic cadence of someone raised in the southern courts. "The girl and the healer have already connected the old poison to the new," Holt was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Draven has confessed everything. It's only a matter of time before they trace it back to us." "Then we accelerate the plan," the woman said, her tone cold and utterly composed, despite the captain's evident fear. "If the king believes the threat ends with one captain and one dead counselor's guilt, he'll stop looking exactly when we need him to stop." Alaric stepped fully into the cellar's lantern light, his voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. "I'm afraid your plan has already failed." Both figures spun toward him, Holt's face draining of color entirely, while the hooded woman's composure remained almost unnervingly steady, even as two soldiers moved to flank the room's only exit. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up and lowered her hood, revealing features Ren had never expected to see in that dim, forgotten cellar. "Lyra," Alaric breathed, his voice cracking with a disbelief so total that Ren felt it strike her own chest like a physical blow. The king's own sister stood before them, her expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light, and for a long, terrible moment, no one in the cellar spoke at all. "You," Alaric said finally, his voice hollow, "you've been part of this from the beginning." "Not from the beginning," Lyra said, her voice steady, despite the weapons now pointed toward her. "Corwin's death was never meant to happen, brother. I swear that to you. But everything since then, yes. I have made certain the network survived, even after Draven believed he had destroyed it." "Why?" Alaric demanded, the single word carrying 10 years of grief and betrayal, compressed into a sound barely recognizable as speech. "Why would you do this to our own people?" "To me?" Lyra's composure finally cracked, just slightly, grief and old resentment bleeding into her voice, for the first time since she had lowered her hood. "Because for 10 years, I watched you disappear into your own grief, while our father's old allies quietly stripped away everything he built. You stopped shifting, you stopped leading hunts, you stopped attending council sessions unless forced. The pack needed a leader who could still run beside them under the full moon, and instead, they had a king who hid in his tower, mourning a woman none of them had ever truly known. So you decided weakening our own villages was an acceptable price to force some kind of change in me." Alaric's voice rose with disbelief and fury in equal measure. "I never intended for it to reach this point," Lyra said. "I believed, foolishly, that if enough pressure built against the crown, you would be forced to shift again, to lead again, before real damage was done. I was wrong. I see that now, watching how far this has gone, without my full understanding of what Holt and the others were truly doing in my name." "People died, Lyra," Ren said quietly, unable to remain silent any longer, her voice trembling with a grief she had carried since kneeling beside Hollis's still body. An old man who spent his whole life building homes for people who had nothing. A young girl who nearly didn't survive the night. "You call that an acceptable price for forcing your brother out of mourning?" Lyra's eyes flickered toward Ren, something like genuine shame crossing her features for the first time. "I did not authorize the poisoning of your village specifically," she said. "That decision was Holt's alone, made without my knowledge, in a desperate attempt to draw the king north and away from the keep, long enough for us to finish erasing the last threads connecting us to the original network." "That's not an excuse," Alaric said. "You built the network that made his decision possible in the first place." Holt, sensing the conversation turning entirely against him, moved suddenly toward the cellar's far wall, where a second hidden passage waited half-concealed, behind a fallen beam. But Edmund was faster, closing the distance in 3 swift strides, and driving the captain to the ground before he could disappear into the tunnel beyond. "It's over, Holt," Edmund said, pinning the struggling captain firmly against the stone floor. "There's nowhere left to run." Alaric turned back to his sister, his expression a devastating mixture of fury and grief that Ren ached to witness, knowing there was nothing she could say or do to ease the particular pain of discovering betrayal within one's own family. "You will answer for this before the full council," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Both of you." "I know," Lyra said quietly, and for the first time, genuine tears slipped down her composed features. "I have known for a long time that this moment was coming. I only hoped, foolishly, that I might fix what I broke before it ever reached you." "You didn't fix anything," Alaric said. "You nearly cost me everything, twice over. Corwin, and now Ren." The name settled heavily in the cellar's stale air, and Ren felt her chest tighten at the raw honesty in his voice, the unmistakable admission that her presence in his life had come to matter as much to him as the woman he had lost a decade before. Lyra's gaze moved between her brother and Ren, understanding dawning slowly across her tear-streaked face. "You care for her," Lyra said softly, "the way you cared for Corwin." Alaric did not answer directly, his jaw tight with grief and fury, and something else entirely, that he was clearly not yet ready to name aloud in front of his sister's betrayal. "Take them both to the keep," he said instead, addressing Edmund and the soldiers. "Under full guard. They'll answer for everything before the council, and I will decide what mercy, if any, this family's betrayal has earned." As the soldiers moved to secure both prisoners, Ren stepped closer to Alaric, resting a steady hand against his arm, the way she had done so many times since the storm at his gate, offering the only comfort she knew how to give, in the face of a grief too large for words. He did not pull away. Instead, he leaned, just slightly, into the quiet strength of her presence, and together they climbed the cellar steps back into the pale afternoon light, carrying with them a truth far heavier and far more painful than either of them had imagined the mill would reveal. The ride back toward the keep passed in near total silence, Alaric riding slightly ahead of the group, with Lyra bound but unharmed, on a horse led by one of the guards, his gaze fixed forward the entire journey, as though looking anywhere else might force him to confront the full weight of what his own sister had done. Ren rode close behind him, giving him the space his grief demanded, while remaining near enough that he would know, without needing to ask, that she had not left his side. It was Garrick, still favoring his healing shoulder, who finally broke the silence, as dusk began to settle over the road. "I don't understand," he said quietly, falling into pace beside Ren. "The king's own sister. How does something like that happen within a family?" "Grief does strange things to people," Ren said, thinking of the 10 years of silence Alaric had carried, the wolf he had refused to let run, the sister who had watched all of it unfold, with no way to reach the brother she remembered. She didn't set out to become what she's become tonight. She told herself, probably for years, that she was protecting something, fixing something, even as the choices she made pulled her further from any version of herself she could still recognize. "That doesn't make it right," Garrick said. "No," Ren agreed, "it doesn't. But understanding how someone arrives at a terrible choice isn't the same as excusing it. Sometimes it just makes the grief that much harder to carry, for everyone involved." Ahead of them, Alaric's shoulders remained rigid, and Ren wondered, not for the first time since the cellar's revelation, what it must feel like to discover that the one person who had remained a constant presence through 10 years of isolation and grief had also, in secret, been quietly unraveling everything he had spent that same decade trying to hold together. They reached the keep well after dark, torches lining the courtyard, where word of the day's events had clearly already begun to spread among the household staff and guards. Lyra was led away under heavy guard to await the full council's judgment, and Holt was placed in a separate chamber, his earlier bravado entirely extinguished, replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who understood exactly how thoroughly his schemes had finally collapsed. Alaric remained in the courtyard long after the prisoners had been secured, staring up at the tower window, where a single lamp still burned, the same window Ren had noticed on her very first night at the keep, and she understood now, with a clarity that ached in her chest, that it had likely been Lyra's chamber all along, the light burning late into countless nights, while she quietly orchestrated the very conspiracy her brother had spent a decade grieving. "You don't have to face the council alone tomorrow," Ren said softly, coming to stand beside him. "I know," Alaric said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I only wish that made tonight easier to bear." "It won't," Ren said honestly. "Grief like this doesn't get easier just because you're not facing it alone. It just becomes something you don't have to carry in complete silence." Alaric turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained since the cellar, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the day settling heavily around them both beneath the cold, star-scattered sky. "Thank you," he said finally, "for staying close enough to remind me of that." Ren offered him a small, tired smile, and together they made their way back into the keep, aware that the following day's council session would demand every remaining reserve of strength either of them still possessed, and that the truth uncovered in that forgotten cellar had only just begun to reshape everything Alaric Vane believed about the family and the kingdom he had spent 10 long years trying to protect. Inside, Edmund waited near the great hall, his expression grave as he approached with a fresh update. "Word of Lyra's arrest has already reached several council members," he said quietly. "There will be pressure tomorrow, Your Majesty, from those who will argue for the harshest possible judgment, and others who will demand mercy simply because of her blood ties to the throne. Either way, the council session will not be simple." "None of this has been simple since the moment Ren appeared at my gate," Alaric said, though there was no bitterness in the words, only a weary acknowledgement of how far the last several days had carried him from the frozen stillness of the decade before. "I'll face the council with the truth, whatever judgment follows. I owe the kingdom that much honesty, even if it costs me the last of my family." "You still have Ren," Edmund said quietly, glancing between the two of them, with the careful discretion of a man who had watched this particular bond grow since the very first night in the storm, and a village full of people who now owe you their lives. That's not nothing, even on a night like this one. Alaric managed a faint, exhausted smile at that, and after Edmund excused himself to oversee the prisoner's continued security, Ren walked with the king toward his study, neither of them quite ready to part ways after the weight of everything the day had revealed. "Get some rest," Ren said finally, pausing at the study door. "Tomorrow we'll ask everything of you that today already has, and more." "Will you be there?" Alaric asked, the question carrying more vulnerability than she had yet heard from him, even in the depths of his grief over Corwin. "At the council session. If you want me there," Ren said. "I do," he said simply, and the honesty of it settled warmly in her chest, despite the heaviness of everything else the day had brought. She left him then, making her way toward the quiet chamber that had become hers over the past several days, and though exhaustion pulled heavily at every part of her, sleep came slowly, her mind turning over the image of Lyra's tear-streaked face in the lantern light, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that had passed between herself and Alaric in the cellar's aftermath, a bond forged through grief and danger that neither of them yet fully understood, but that both of them, she suspected, were no longer willing to let go. The great hall had never felt so cold to Ren as it did the moment Lyra was led in, before the full council, chains at her wrists, glinting in the morning light, pouring through the high windows. Every seat along the long stone table was filled. Elder pack leaders and minor lords from across the northern territories gathered in tense, murmuring silence, and Ren felt the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes turning toward her as she took her place near the front of the hall at Alaric's request. She had never stood before such a gathering, had never imagined herself anywhere near the center of northern politics, and yet here she was, a border healer standing witness to a king's reckoning with his own blood. Alaric sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, and when the council's eldest member, a stern woman named Petronella, who had served 3 generations of the royal family, finally called the session to order, the hall fell into a silence so complete that Ren could hear her own heartbeat. "Councillor Draven has already confessed his role in concealing the original conspiracy," Petronella said, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "The council has heard testimony regarding Captain Holt's direct involvement in poisoning the border village. What remains is the matter of Lady Lyra, sister to the crown, and the full extent of her involvement in reviving a network that has now claimed lives on 2 separate occasions, a decade apart." Lyra stood with her chin lifted, refusing to look away from the assembled council despite the chains at her wrists, and when Petronella invited her to speak, she did so with a steadiness that surprised Ren, given the raw grief she had witnessed in the cellar the night before. "I will not pretend my choices were anything other than what they were," Lyra said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I helped maintain a network I believed I could control, believing it would eventually force my brother to reclaim the throne he had abandoned in all but title. I did not intend for anyone to die. That does not excuse the deaths that resulted from choices I made possible." A murmur rippled through the council at her words, some faces hardening with disapproval, others softening slightly at the evident sincerity of her admission. Petronella turned to Alaric, her expression carefully neutral. "The council awaits your judgment, Your Majesty. As king, and as her brother, the decision rests ultimately with you, though we are bound to advise." Alaric rose slowly from his seat, and Ren watched him with her heart in her throat, aware of exactly how much this moment would cost him regardless of the choice he made. "My sister's actions have caused irreparable harm," he said, his voice steady despite the visible strain beneath it. "Lives were lost that should never have been lost. That truth cannot be softened by any explanation of intention, however sincerely offered." He paused, and for a moment, Ren feared the worst, the same cold, controlled grief she had first witnessed the night she met him, settling over his features once more. But when he continued, something had shifted in his voice, a hard-won steadiness that had not been there 10 years before. "However," Alaric continued, "exile without recourse would remove any possibility of my sister ever making amends for what she has done, and death would only add one more tragedy to a story already heavy with them. I sentence Lyra to permanent removal from the line of succession, and to 10 years of labor within the healing houses of the northern villages, under Ren Ashby's direct oversight, tending to the very people whose lives were endangered by the network she helped sustain. The council erupted into low, urgent discussion at the unexpected mercy of the sentence, and Ren felt her own breath catch at the responsibility suddenly placed upon her. Though beneath the surprise, she recognized the wisdom in it, a chance for Lyra to face the direct human cost of her choices, in a way that punishment alone could never accomplish. Lyra's composed expression finally broke, tears slipping freely down her face, as she looked at her brother, with an emotion far more complicated than simple gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't deserve this mercy, but I will spend every remaining year of my life trying to earn it." "See that you do," Alaric said, his voice rough with the effort of extending forgiveness he clearly still felt the weight of. "For the sake of everyone, your choices have already harmed." Captain Holt's judgment followed swiftly, and without the complicated mercy extended to Lyra, the council unanimous in stripping him of rank and sentencing him to permanent exile from the Northern Territories, his direct role in the poisoning leaving little room for leniency. Draven's judgment, delayed for further deliberation given the complexity of his decade-old choices, was set aside for a separate council session in the following weeks, though Alaric made clear that whatever punishment followed, Draven's decades of loyal service prior to his failure would weigh heavily in the final decision. As the council session finally drew to a close, exhaustion settled over the great hall like a physical weight, and Ren found herself standing beside Alaric as the last of the council members filed out, murmuring amongst themselves about the strange, difficult mercy their king had shown his own sister. "You didn't have to give her that chance," Ren said quietly, once they were finally alone. "I know," Alaric said, "but punishing her without any path toward redemption felt like exactly the kind of frozen, grief-locked justice I've spent 10 years mistaking for strength. I don't want to be that king anymore. I don't think I have been, not really, since the night you stood at my gate." That evening, as the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting the keep's towers in deep amber light, Ren felt something in the air shift, a subtle charge she recognized from her childhood in the village, where the full moon had always brought a particular restlessness to every wolf within the settlement. "Tonight is the full moon," she said, finding Alaric standing once more at his study window, watching the sky darken toward evening. "I'm aware," he said quietly. "Will you run with your pack tonight?" He turned to look at her, something vulnerable and uncertain crossing his features, the same expression she had seen the moment before he shifted to save her life on the road north. "I haven't run under a full moon with my own people in 10 years, he admitted. "I don't know if I remember how to do it as anything other than a battle response." "Then let's find out together," Ren said, holding out her hand the way she had that very first night at his gate. Alaric studied her outstretched palm for a long moment, and then, slowly, he took it, his fingers closing warmly around hers, and together they made their way down through the keep and out into the courtyard, where word had already begun to spread that their king might, for the first time in a decade, join his pack beneath the rising moon. By the time full darkness settled over the Northern Territories, a crowd had gathered at the edge of the keep's great open field, pack members from every corner of the territory drawn by rumors too significant to ignore. Alaric stood at the center of that gathering, Ren beside him, and as the moon rose full and silver above the mountains, he closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and let 10 years of careful, grief-bound restraint finally fall away. The shift came easier this time than it had on the road, less violent, less like something breaking, and more like something long buried, finally allowed to surface. Where a man had stood a moment before, the great black wolf now stood beneath the moonlight, and this time, there was no grief clouding his pale eyes, only a raw, overwhelming relief that rippled visibly through his powerful frame. The pack's reaction was immediate and thunderous, a chorus of howls rising up around the field as wolf after wolf shifted and joined their king in a celebration that had been 10 long years in the waiting. Ren stood at the edge of that joyous chaos, watching Alaric run freely among his people, for the first time since she had known him, and felt her own eyes fill with unexpected tears at the sight of a broken thing, finally, gloriously, made whole again. When Alaric finally returned to her side, shifting back into his human form amid the fading echoes of the pack's celebration, he did not immediately speak. He simply reached for her hand once more, holding it with a quiet reverence that carried more meaning than any words could have offered, and together, they watched the moon climb higher above the mountains, marking the first night in 10 years that the Alpha King's wolf had run free beneath its silver light. Edmund found them there sometime later, still standing at the edge of the field, long after most of the pack had drifted back toward the keep, their laughter and celebration fading into the cool night air. His expression, usually so carefully composed, had softened into something Ren had never seen on him before, a quiet, unguarded joy that seemed to catch even him by surprise. "I served your father before you," Edmund said quietly, addressing Alaric. "I remember the day you were born, and the day you first shifted as a boy, so proud you could barely stop talking about it for a week. I never thought I would live to see you stop running with your own pack, and I confess, some nights I feared I would never see you start again." "I feared that too," Alaric admitted. "What changed it, in the end?" Edmund asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer, his gaze flicking briefly toward Ren, before returning respectfully to his king. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty he had shown throughout the difficult day. 10 years of grief taught me that staying human, staying slow, was a way of punishing myself for a failure I never truly forgave, he said finally. But somewhere in the last several days, standing beside a woman who has never once flinched from difficult truths, I remembered that punishing myself has never once brought Corwin back, and it has cost me and my pack far more than it ever gave in return. Edmund nodded slowly, clearly moved by the admission, and after a respectful pause, he excused himself to oversee the pack's return to the keep, leaving Alaric and Ren alone once more, beneath the fading moonlight. "Your people needed this tonight," Ren said softly, watching the last few wolves in the distance make their way back toward the tree line surrounding the keep. "More than I think even you realized." "I know," Alaric said. "I could feel it, the moment I shifted. 10 years of distance between myself and my own pack, closed in a single night." He turned to look at her fully then, something warm and unguarded in his expression that she had not yet seen from him, not even in the quiet intimacy of their shared grief over the past several days. "I don't think I could have found my way back to this without you." "You found your own way back," Ren said. "I just refused to let you hide from it any longer." "That's more than anyone else managed in 10 years, Alaric said, "including myself." They walked back toward the keep slowly, neither of them in any particular hurry to end the quiet peace of the night, and as they crossed the courtyard toward the warmth of the great hall, Ren found herself thinking of Hollis, of Petra's fevered recovery, of the long, difficult road that had led her from a storm-soaked gate to this unexpected moment beneath a full and healing moon. Whatever came next, whatever judgment still awaited Draven, whatever quiet reckoning Lyra faced in the years of service ahead of her, Ren understood, with a certainty that settled warmly in her chest, that the man walking beside her was no longer the frozen, grief-locked king she had first approached with an open hand in the rain. He was, for the first time in a very long while, simply Alaric, wolf and man both, whole again, beneath the same sky that had once watched him break. The messenger arrived at dawn with blood on his sleeve and terror in his voice, and the words he gasped out before collapsing sent Ren's entire world tilting sideways. "Your village," he managed, as Alaric caught him before he could hit the floor. "Armed riders. They came in the night." Ren was moving before the messenger had even finished speaking, her mind racing through every worst possibility, as she called for her satchel and a fresh horse. Alaric caught her arm, his expression grim but steady, the same controlled focus she had come to recognize in him during moments of true crisis. "Tell me everything," Alaric said to the messenger, kneeling beside him as one of the physicians rushed to check his wounds. "Southern riders," the man gasped, wearing no colors, but well-armed, well-organized. "They went straight for the well, and when the villagers tried to stop them, they turned their weapons on anyone who resisted. Nora sent me the moment the attack began. She said they were asking about a healer's notes, records of the water, anything that could prove what caused the sickness. They're trying to destroy the last evidence connecting the poisoning to the network," Alaric said, his voice hardening with realization. "Holt's exile hasn't stopped whoever financed this from the beginning. If they believe your village still holds proof of their involvement, they'll burn it to the ground rather than risk exposure." "Petra," Ren said, her stomach dropping with sudden, sharp fear. "She's the only living witness who saw the poisoning happen. If they're looking for proof, she's the most dangerous loose end they have left." Alaric's expression turned to iron. "Then we ride now," with everyone we can spare." Within the hour, a full company of soldiers had assembled in the courtyard, Alaric at their head, his black wolf's restless energy visible even in his human form, as he mounted his horse with a grim urgency Ren had not seen from him since the rogue wolf attack on the road. She rode close beside him, her healer's satchel packed with every remedy she could gather on short notice, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with the hard pace of their journey, and everything to do with the image of Petra's small, trusting face. They rode through the day and into the night without stopping, the horses lathered with exhaustion by the time the first distant glow of firelight became visible against the dark horizon ahead, and Ren felt her chest tighten with dread at the sight of smoke rising from what she knew, with sickening certainty, must be her own village. "They're burning it," she breathed. "Not all of it," Alaric said, urging his horse faster. "Look, the fire is concentrated near the square. They're still searching, not simply destroying everything outright." The convoy thundered into the village edge, just as a group of armed riders emerged from Nora's house, dragging a struggling figure between them, and Ren's heart seized as she recognized Petra's small form fighting desperately against the men holding her. "Petra!" Ren screamed, and the sound tore from her with such raw desperation that several of the riders turned in surprise at the sudden arrival of armed soldiers, thundering into the square. Alaric was off his horse and shifting before Ren had even fully processed what was happening, the great black wolf covering the distance to the riders in a blur of motion that scattered them in immediate panic. He struck the man holding Petra with enough force to send him sprawling, and the girl stumbled free, running toward Ren with tears streaming down her frightened face. The remaining riders scattered into a chaotic skirmish with the arriving soldiers, and Ren caught Petra in her arms, pulling her quickly toward the relative safety of a nearby doorway, while the battle raged around them. "You're safe now," Ren said fiercely, holding the trembling girl close. "I've got you." "They kept asking about my dream," Petra sobbed. "About the man at the well. I wouldn't tell them anything. I swear I didn't." "You did nothing wrong," Ren said. "None of this is your fault." Around them, the village had erupted into chaos, soldiers clashing with the armed riders in the flickering firelight, while terrified villagers fled toward whatever shelter they could find. Ren caught sight of Alaric, still in wolf form, moving through the fighting, with a ferocity she had only glimpsed once before, on the road north, and this time there was no grief clouding his eyes, only a fierce, protective fury, directed entirely at defending the people who had already suffered so much, because of secrets that predated their involvement entirely. One of the riders, larger and more heavily armed than the others, broke away from the main skirmish, and turned directly toward the doorway where Ren shielded Petra, his blade raised with clear, murderous intent. Ren had only a heartbeat to react, pulling Petra behind her and raising her small belt knife in a futile gesture of defense, when the black wolf slammed into the attacking rider, with enough force to end the threat before it could reach them. Alaric stood over the fallen rider for a moment, chest heaving, before turning back to Ren with an expression that carried the same raw devotion she had seen the night he first shifted to save her life on the mountain road. He did not need words to communicate what passed between them in that moment, a promise renewed in the middle of chaos, that whatever threatened her, whatever threatened the people she had sworn to protect, would answer to him directly. The skirmish did not last much longer after that. The remaining riders either captured or fled into the surrounding darkness, and as dawn began to break over the smoldering village, Ren finally allowed herself to breathe, Petra safe in her arms, Nora emerging shaken but unharmed from where she had hidden during the worst of the fighting. Alaric, shifted back into human form and breathing hard from the fight, approached the small cluster of survivors gathering in the square, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. "We captured 3 riders alive," he said. "They'll answer for who sent them, and we'll finally learn exactly how far this conspiracy still reaches, beyond Holt and my sister." "Is it over?" Nora asked quietly, her voice trembling with the exhaustion of a night no one in the village would soon forget. "Not entirely," Alaric admitted, "but we are closer to ending it than we have ever been, and this time, I do not intend to let 10 more years pass before the truth is fully uncovered." Ren looked around at the smoldering ruins of the village square, at Hollis's memorial marker still standing near the well, at Petra trembling but alive in her arms, and felt a fierce, unshakable resolve settle over her own grief. Whatever remained of the conspiracy that had shaped a decade of Alaric's life, and nearly claimed her village twice over, She intended to see it ended completely, whatever it cost either of them in the difficult days still ahead. The captured riders were brought before Alaric within the hour, bound and stripped of their weapons, and Ren watched from a short distance as he questioned them with a cold, controlled authority that reminded her of the man she had first met in his study, though tempered now with none of the frozen grief that had once defined him. The eldest of the three riders, a hard-faced man with graying hair, remained defiantly silent through the first round of questioning, but the youngest, barely more than a boy, broke quickly under the weight of what he had witnessed that night. "We were paid by agents from the Southern Territories," the young rider admitted, his voice shaking. "I don't know their names. We were told only to retrieve or destroy any records connecting the water sickness to a network operating out of the South, and to silence anyone who could testify to what they'd seen." "Who gave you these orders directly?" Alaric demanded. "A man called only the steward," the rider said. "He never showed his face. All instructions came through sealed letters, delivered by riders who never lingered long enough to be questioned." Alaric's jaw tightened at the deliberate anonymity of it all, the careful, layered concealment that had clearly protected whoever truly stood behind the conspiracy from ever being directly named. "This steward," he said slowly, "is the same person who financed the original network 10 years ago." "I believe so." Draven's voice came from behind them, and Ren turned to see the counselor arriving with a small escort, having ridden through the night the moment word reached the keep of the attack. His expression was haggard, but his eyes carried a sharp, focused clarity Ren had not seen from him since his confession in the study. "I suspected as much when I first traced the smuggling routes a decade ago, though I could never confirm a name behind the title. Whoever the steward truly is, they have remained hidden behind layers of intermediaries for at least 10 years, likely longer." "Then we finally have a direction to search," Alaric said. "A title, a pattern of financing, and now, 3 captured men who can help identify the routes their orders traveled through." Ren, still holding Petra close, felt a fresh wave of exhaustion settle over her at the realization that even now, with Holt exiled and Lyra sentenced, the true architect of the conspiracy remained hidden somewhere beyond their reach. "How much further does this go?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Alaric admitted, his voice heavy with the same weary honesty he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "But I intend to find out, thoroughly this time, rather than burying the threat the way it was buried once before." As the soldiers moved the captured riders toward transport back to the keep, Ren turned her attention back to the village, to the frightened faces of survivors beginning to emerge from hiding, to the physicians already moving among them checking for injuries. Nora approached, her arm bandaged from a wound sustained during the fighting, and pulled Ren into a fierce, grateful embrace. "You came back," Nora said. "Both of you. I didn't think help would arrive in time." "We'll always come back," Ren said, glancing toward Alaric, who was already directing soldiers to begin repairs on the damaged buildings near the square. "Whatever it costs, this village will not be left to face this alone again." Petra, still trembling but growing steadier in Ren's arms, looked up with the particular resilience that only children seem to fully possess, even after the worst of nights. "Is it really over now?" she asked. Ren glanced toward Alaric one final time, watching him move through the wreckage of the village with the same steady protective purpose that had first drawn her attention in his study days before, and found she could not yet promise the girl a clean and simple ending. "Not entirely," Ren said honestly. "But we're closer than we've ever been, and this time, we won't stop until it's finished completely." That evening, once the fires had been fully extinguished and the wounded tended, Alaric found Ren sitting alone near the well, watching the water finally run clear, beneath the light of the same moon that had witnessed his wolf run free only nights before. He settled beside her without a word, exhaustion evident in every line of his frame, and for a long while they simply sat together in silence, the village slowly settling into an uneasy but survived quiet around them. "I keep thinking about the steward," Ren said finally. "Whoever they are, they've stayed hidden through 2 attacks, 10 years apart. That kind of patience frightens me more than Holt or your sister ever did." "It frightens me too," Alaric admitted. "But patience like that also means whoever they are has never had to act quickly, never had to expose themselves directly. Tonight, they lost 3 men, and failed to silence the one witness who could still testify against them. That's not nothing. That's the first real crack in 10 years of careful hiding. Do you think they'll try again? I think they'll be more careful now, Alaric said. Which means we need to be more careful too. And faster than we've been so far. He turned to look at her. Something gentler entering his exhausted expression despite the gravity of the conversation. But not tonight. Tonight, we've earned a single evening, where the only thing that matters is that Petra is alive, and Nora is alive, and you are alive. Ren allowed herself, finally, to lean into the quiet comfort of his presence, the two of them sitting together, beside the well, that had nearly destroyed everything she loved twice over, now finally beginning to heal, alongside the village it had once poisoned. Tomorrow, we hunt the steward, she said quietly. Tomorrow, Alaric agreed. Tonight, we simply survive, together, the way we have every night, since the storm first brought you to my gate. The eldest captured rider finally broke his silence 3 days after the attack, and the name he gave brought Alaric's entire investigation full circle, in a way none of them had anticipated. Baron Renfrew, the man said, his voice hoarse from days of confinement. He operates through intermediaries, but the coin that pays for every order comes from his southern estates. He's spent years building alliances among border lords, resentful of the Northern Crown's authority over trade routes through the mountain passes. Ren, present at Alaric's request during the questioning, felt a cold understanding settle over her at the name. The mountain pass, she said. The one that collapsed on our way north. That wasn't only meant to stop us from reaching the village. It was meant to weaken exactly the trade route Renfrew wants to control. Everything connects, Alaric said grimly, once the rider had been led away, and the two of them stood alone in the study that had become the center of so much of this ordeal. Corwin's death, the smuggling network, Holt, my sister's misguided involvement, even the collapsed pass, all of it circling back to one man, patient enough to spend a decade building toward a single goal. What happens now? Ren asked. Now we go to him directly, Alaric said. Quietly gathered evidence and captured testimony will only carry so much weight against a baron with powerful allies of his own. I need to confront him where he cannot hide behind intermediaries any longer. The journey south took the better part of 2 weeks, Alaric traveling with a carefully chosen escort that included Edmund, 2 of his most trusted soldiers, and Ren, who refused outright to be left behind after everything the two of them had already survived together. Draven, in a gesture that spoke to his desperate desire for redemption, offered his own knowledge of Renfrew's southern estates, having quietly monitored the Baron's activities for years, without ever having enough proof to act. They arrived at Renfrew's estate on a cold, clear morning, the Baron's guards initially refusing entry until Alaric's identity, and the full weight of his authority as Alpha King, made clear that refusal was no longer a viable option. They found Renfrew in his private study, an older man with sharp, calculating eyes that betrayed no surprise at their arrival, as though he had long anticipated this exact confrontation. Your Majesty, Renfrew said, rising with practiced courtesy that did nothing to disguise the tension beneath it. I confess, I did not expect the honor of a personal visit. You've had 10 years to prepare for it, Alaric said, his voice hard. I know about the network. I know about the poison, the smuggling routes, the collapsed pass, and the men you sent to silence a witness in a village that has already suffered enough because of your ambitions. Renfrew's composure held, though something calculating shifted behind his eyes, the look of a man rapidly reassessing his options in the face of an accusation he could no longer simply deny into obscurity. Ambitious accusations require ambitious proof, Your Majesty. I have 3 captured men willing to testify against you, Alaric said. I have Captain Holt's confession, my own sister's testimony, and Counselor Draven's decade of quiet investigation. I have Ren Ashby, who nearly lost her entire village to your schemes, twice, and who stands here today, willing to speak before any council in this kingdom, about exactly what you've cost her people. Ren stepped forward, meeting Renfrew's calculating gaze without flinching, the same steady composure that had first carried her through 5 hours of storm at Alaric's gate, now carrying her through this final confrontation. You poisoned a well that killed an old man who spent his whole life helping others, she said. You nearly killed a 12-year-old girl. You sent armed men to burn my village to the ground, rather than risk your secret becoming known. Whatever power you believe your coin and your alliances still protect you with, it will not be enough to erase what you've done. For a long, tense moment, Renfrew said nothing. and Ren watched the calculation behind his eyes slowly shift into something closer to resignation, the recognition of a man who understood, finally, that 10 years of careful patience had ended in exactly the confrontation he had spent a decade trying to avoid. I built this network to weaken a crown I believed had grown too comfortable, too complacent, in its control over trade, that should have been shared more equally among the northern and southern territories, Renfrew said finally, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence. I did not intend for so much death to follow, but I will not pretend the deaths that occurred were an acceptable price I refused to pay, for what I believed was a fairer distribution of power. That is not your decision to make, Alaric said, his voice cold with a decade of accumulated grief finally finding its target. Not through poison, not through the deaths of people who had no part in whatever grievance you held against my crown. Renfrew's guards, sensing the shift in the room, moved uneasily, but Alaric's own soldiers had already positioned themselves to prevent any attempt at escape or resistance, and within moments, the Baron found himself disarmed and detained, his decade-long conspiracy finally, completely, unraveled. The journey back north felt different than any of the roads Ren had traveled since that first storm-soaked night at the keep's gate. The weight of uncertainty that had hung over every mile of the journey south had lifted, replaced by something lighter, a fragile but genuine sense that the long shadow cast by Corwin's death might finally begin to recede into something the northern territories could heal from completely. Renfrew's trial before the full council, held weeks later, ended in a sentence of permanent exile and the seizure of his southern estates, the network he had built, dismantled entirely by soldiers working alongside Draven's careful knowledge of its remaining roots and connections. Draven himself received a lighter sentence than many had expected, stripped of his council position, but permitted to remain within the keep as an advisor on matters of security. His decade of guilt and quiet service weighed carefully against the harm his original silence had allowed to fester. Lyra began her service in the healing houses that same season, working alongside Ren in the very village her choices had endangered, and though the road to any real redemption remained long, Ren found, in the weeks that followed, a cautious respect growing between them, born from shared labor and honest reckoning, rather than easy forgiveness. It was on a clear evening, months after Renfrew's exile, that Alaric found Ren in the village square, checking on Petra's continued recovery and the steady rebuilding of homes damaged in the attack. The well stood fully restored behind her, its water running clean and clear, a small stone marker beside it honoring Hollis's memory and the sacrifice his death had ultimately helped prevent from being repeated. I have something to ask you, Alaric said, his voice carrying a nervousness Ren had never before heard from the composed, controlled king she had first met in his study. You've asked me plenty of difficult things these past months, Ren said, smiling despite the fatigue of a long day's work. I don't think there's much left that could surprise me. This might, Alaric said, and reaching into his coat, he withdrew a small, simply carved ring, nothing like the ornate jewelry Ren had glimpsed among the nobility at court, but rather something clearly made, with careful, personal attention. 10 years ago, I lost the chance to build a life with someone I loved, and I spent that decade believing I had lost, along with her, any capacity to run freely, as my true self again. You held out your hand at my gate in the middle of a storm, and you have not once let go of it since, through every danger, every difficult truth, every broken piece of my family and my kingdom that we've had to face together. Ren felt her breath catch, the weight of everything they had survived together settling warmly around the moment unfolding before her. I am not asking you to become simply my queen, Alaric continued. I am asking you to remain exactly what you have already become, the person who reminds me, every single day, what it means to be whole. Will you marry me, Ren Ashby, and stand beside me, not as a healer summoned to my kingdom's crisis, but as the woman who taught an Alpha King how to run free again? Ren looked at the ring, at the man holding it out to her with the same open, vulnerable honesty she had offered him that first stormy night, and felt her own hand rise, without hesitation, to meet his. Yes, she said simply, and as his fingers closed warmly around hers, the village around them seemed to hold its breath in quiet, grateful witness, the well behind them running clear, the memory of every hard, dangerous mile between that first storm and this gentle evening, finally settling into something that felt, at long last, entirely like peace. That night, Beneath a sky scattered with stars and a moon just beginning to wax toward fullness, the Alpha King of the Northern Pax knelt in the village square that had once nearly destroyed everything he loved, and pledged himself, wolf and man both, to the healer, who had held out her hand in a storm, and never once let it fall. Word of the engagement spread through the northern territories faster than any royal proclamation could have carried it, villagers and pack leaders alike finding in the news a symbol far larger than a simple royal marriage. For 10 years, the kingdom had watched its king grieve in silence, his wolf hidden, his heart guarded so completely that even those closest to him had feared he might never fully return to the man he had once been. Now, that same king stood ready to build a new life, with a woman who had proven, time and again, that she would not be turned away by storms, by danger, or by the weight of secrets a decade in the making. The wedding itself took place at the height of summer, held not within the formal stone halls of the keep, but in the open fields, where Alaric had first run free beneath the full moon, after 10 years of silence. Ren wore no elaborate gown, choosing instead a simple dress in soft blue, insisting that the day reflect the honesty that had brought them together, rather than the pageantry expected of royal ceremonies. Nora stood beside her as her closest attendant, and Petra, fully recovered and glowing with the particular joy of a child who understood she had witnessed something remarkable unfold, scattered wildflowers along the path leading to where Alaric waited. Lyra, granted brief leave from her service in the healing houses to attend, stood among the gathered witnesses, with an expression of quiet, hard-won peace, the distance between herself and her brother slowly narrowing through months of honest reckoning and shared purpose. Draven, too, stood present, older and more weathered than he had seemed even months before, but carrying himself with the lighter step of a man finally freed from a decade of solitary guilt. As the ceremony reached its final moment, Alaric took Ren's hands in his own, the same hands that had held out an open palm to him in a storm so many months before, and spoke the vows that bound them together, before the assembled pack and villagers alike. "I vow to run beside you, in every form I carry, through every storm that finds us," he said, "and to never again mistake stillness for strength, when the woman I love stands ready to face whatever comes, together." Ren, her own voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes, answered in kind, "I vow to hold out my hand for as long as you need it, and to remind you, every single day, that a king who runs freely beside his people is far stronger than one who hides behind his own grief." When the ceremony ended, cheers rose up from the gathered crowd, and as the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting the fields in warm amber light, Alaric could not resist one final gesture, shifting into his great black wolf form before the assembled crowd, no longer a private struggle hidden behind palace walls, but a joyous, public declaration of everything he had reclaimed. Ren laughed, delighted rather than startled, and reached out to rest her hand against his powerful shoulder, exactly as she had done on the road north, the very first time she had seen him run free. The pack howled together beneath the setting sun, a sound of celebration rather than mourning, and somewhere among the gathered crowd, Old Hollis's memorial marker stood quietly witness to a village and a kingdom, finally healed from a decade of hidden grief. No one had seen the Alpha King's wolf in 10 long years, until the night a stubborn, storm-soaked healer held out her hand and refused to let it fall, and in the golden light of that summer evening, surrounded by the family and kingdom he had nearly lost to silence, Alaric Vane finally understood that some wounds, however deep, could still be run through, together, into whatever came next.